Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
She waited until every last chair around the table had been pulled out, until each plate had a matching napkin, folded just so, and every wine glass had been filled with the vintage she always insisted was Mom's favorite, even though it gave her a headache, before she stood up at the head of Aunt Carrie's over-polished oak dining table and said, in that voice she used when she wanted attention, "Mom asked me to read the will myself. She thought it would be more personal." The way she said it made it sound like it was some kind of Broadway monologue and not the dividing line between dignity and disgrace. At first, I thought she was joking. I even chuckled quietly until I caught her eyes. There wasn't an ounce of humor in them, just self-satisfaction. That's how I found out, on a Tuesday evening with the clink of silverware and the hum of a refrigerator in the background, that I had been cut off, not minimized, not given less than I expected. Completely, entirely, astonishingly cut out. No house, no car, no antiques, no family jewelry, not even the box of old letters I once spent 3 summers helping Mom organize while she was going through radiation treatments and couldn't get off the couch. Nothing. Just a line, read with no emotion. And to my daughter Lisa, I leave my love and my gratitude. That was it. Not even a gift card to Bed Bath & Beyond. If you're wondering what that feels like, imagine being stripped bare in front of everyone you've ever tried to impress, while your younger sister beams like she's just won an Emmy. That dinner, which was supposed to be a quiet family moment of remembrance, turned into a public execution with cheese platters and sparkling cider. Tina read that will like she was reading a wedding toast. She smiled at all the right parts, paused dramatically at the sad bits, and looked around for applause at the end. I sat there in silence, not because I didn't have things to say, but because I wasn't sure which version of reality everyone else in that room was living in. The kind where Tina was the hero for taking on the responsibility of executing Mom's wishes, or the one where I had apparently hallucinated the last 3 years of being the sole caregiver, power of attorney, and human punching bag for a woman who only ever had love to give when she was in pain. And she was in pain a lot. For context, because stories like this always need context, our mother had been diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer 3 years ago. The doctors gave her 6 months. She lasted 37. 37 months of chemo, surgeries, infections, emergency room visits, side effects, hallucinations, lost hair, lost appetite, lost temper. And through it all, I was there. I was the one who made sure the nurses remembered her name. I was the one who drove her to every appointment, argued with insurance reps, made peace with her neighbors when the hospice nurse parked in the wrong driveway. I was the one who watched her wither down to 91 pounds and held her hand when the morphine made her see things that weren't there. Tina, on the other hand, hadn't spoken to Mom in over a year before she got sick. Some falling out involving our dad's old boat, and something about a loan she was supposed to pay back but never did. But the minute she heard terminal, she showed up like a miracle. It was almost poetic, the way she swooped in with her blonde curls and fake empathy, talking about closure and family time. And Mom, desperate for comfort in her final months, let her back in without hesitation. I don't blame my mother, not entirely. Dying makes people sentimental, foggy even. They start remembering things the way they wish they happened. Tina was always the baby, always the one Mom made excuses for. She's just more sensitive, she'd say when Tina skipped birthdays. She has a hard time asking for help. She'd mutter when Tina drained Mom's savings, temporarily. I just never thought that kind of loyalty would extend to the grave. So when Tina stood there, wine glass in one hand, folder in the other, and read the will like it was a recipe she was proud of, I didn't interrupt, I didn't argue. I didn't ask where the lawyer was or why this was being handled in someone's dining room instead of an office. I just sat there, watching, waiting, processing. I think the others around the table didn't know what to do either. You could feel it in the air, the stiffness, the shuffling, the awkward throat clearing. Uncle Don tried to lighten the mood with a weak, "Well, your mom always had a flair for the dramatic," and someone near the end of the table let out a nervous giggle. But nobody looked at me, not directly. They just looked around or down or at Tina, who seemed to glow a little brighter the more uncomfortable everyone else became. Afterward, people started peeling off. Some hugged Tina. Some offered vague words of encouragement to me like, "I'm sure she meant well, and you know how sick she was." I smiled and nodded, said thank you, acted gracious. But inside I was on fire. Not because I wanted the money or the jewelry or even the house. No, it was about the principle. It was about being erased, being treated like a footnote in a story I wrote every single chapter of. That night, when I got back to my place, a 2-bedroom apartment I was barely affording after taking all that time off work, I sat on the floor in the dark and stared at the last photo I had of Mom smiling, taken just 3 weeks before she died. I remember thinking how unfair it all felt, how utterly senseless. And then, like a switch had been flipped, I realized something. If Tina wanted to act like the protagonist, let her. Let her bask in the applause, the inheritance, the attention. Let her be the star of a show she didn't even show up for until the final act. Because I wasn't going to try and rewrite the script anymore. I was going to write the sequel, and I already had the perfect ending in mind. It's funny, in a sick, twisted kind of way, how quickly people rewrite the story when it's no longer convenient to remember who you used to be before things turned sour. And suddenly I went from being the loyal daughter who everyone said was stronger than they'd ever be in my shoes, to the bitter one, the unstable one, the woman who clearly couldn't accept her mother's final wishes because she must have expected something, because apparently devoting 3 years of your life to keeping someone alive, while quietly letting your own fall apart, wasn't love. It was some sort of transaction in their eyes, and now that I didn't get paid, I was just bitter. That's what people whispered, and they always whisper when they want you to hear it. At first, I tried to be civil. I kept telling myself that maybe there had been some mistake. Maybe the will was old or the lawyer had been misinformed. Maybe Mom had been confused, drugged up, or misled by Tina, who had always known how to manipulate a moment until it looked like compassion. But when I reached out to the attorney, the same one who had supposedly drafted the will, I was met with a polite but unmovable wall of finality. Yes, that was the most recent version. Yes, your mother was of sound mind. No, there is no record of a previous draft. And no, there is no legal basis to challenge anything unless you have proof of coercion, which of course I didn't, because people like Tina don't leave fingerprints when they twist the knife. I kept trying to be reasonable, thinking maybe Tina would at least offer to sit down and talk, to explain why she had been given everything, even though deep down I knew she wouldn't. Because people who benefit from silence never ask questions. They just enjoy the spoils and act confused when you ask where your chair at the table went. I reached out to her once, a short message, just a single sentence really. "Can we talk about the will?" And she left it on read for 3 days before finally responding with, "I don't think this is healthy for you. Maybe some time and distance will help." That was the moment it clicked. Not like a revelation, but like a slow, creeping rot that had finally reached my stomach. This wasn't some misunderstanding. This was exactly how she wanted it to go, and the worst part wasn't that I had been cut off. It was that she wanted me to know it, to sit with it, to feel it every time I looked at the life I'd given up to be there for Mom, while she showed up at the last minute and got handed the lead role without even auditioning. And then the calls started coming, not from Tina, no, she was too smart to handle it directly, but from well-meaning relatives and old family friends who had somehow heard I was struggling to accept things, the way people say someone's off their meds, without ever having asked if they were on any in the first place. Aunt Carrie suggested a grief counselor, with that pitying look people get when they're trying not to sound judgmental, but can't help it anyway. Uncle Don told me, sometimes parents have reasons we just don't understand. Cousin Deb asked if I'd been sleeping okay and offered me the number for her therapist, the same one who helped her when she went through that thing with her cat. I thanked them all, smiled, nodded, played the role, and then cried in my car on the way home more times than I'll ever admit. I wasn't losing my mind. I was losing my narrative. I went from caregiver to pariah in under a week, and it didn't take long for the social invitations to dry up, for people to start avoiding eye contact at the grocery store, for my own coworkers to start asking if I was taking enough time for myself. Because no one wants to side with the person who got left out. It's messy, it's uncomfortable. It makes people wonder about their own families, their own loose ends, their own unpaid debts. And the easiest way to silence that noise is to pretend the person raising the issue is just unstable. So I stopped talking. I let them think whatever they wanted because words weren't going to fix this. I started focusing on something else, something quieter, more permanent, something that didn't require anyone's approval. I went back to Mom's house a few days later. Tina hadn't moved in yet. She was handling some estate stuff, which probably meant planning her next vacation or shopping for expensive furniture with the money she didn't earn. I still had a key. No one had thought to take it from me, probably assuming I wouldn't have the nerve to go back. And when I walked through the door, it hit me, not like grief this time, but like clarity. The place didn't feel like hers anymore. It didn't feel like mine either. It felt like a museum curated by someone who never understood the exhibits. I started packing things, slowly at first. Just the books Mom loved, the records she used to play when she cooked, the photographs she kept in her nightstand because they were too personal for the wall. I didn't cry, I didn't even flinch. I started researching local women's shelters, organizations that help domestic violence survivors, even a community center that offered job training to single mothers. I called them up one by one and asked if they accepted furniture, clothing, jewelry, and collectibles. Most of them did. I didn't tell anyone, not yet, not even my closest friends. I needed time to make sure it was done right, that it was legal, and most importantly, that it couldn't be undone. I found a lawyer, one who specialized in charitable transfers, and I showed him everything I planned to give away. As long as I was the one who handled the distribution, and none of it was officially part of the deed or financial assets transferred to Tina yet, there was a gray area that gave me just enough room to work. It became my project, my purpose. I documented every item, every donation, every signature, every receipt. I kept copies of every transfer, had photos of each room before and after, and even started putting together a binder labeled "In Her Name." It wasn't about revenge, not entirely. It was about truth, about reclaiming the story that had been stolen from me and rewriting it in ink they couldn't erase. And the more I worked, the quieter I became, which is probably why no one saw it coming, not even Tina. There's a moment when you've been humiliated, patronized, and quietly erased by the people who once claimed to love you, where you realize that no amount of dignity or being the bigger person is going to restore what you lost. Not because it can't be restored, but because it was never taken from you fairly in the first place. It was stolen, rewritten, and wrapped in a neat little bow of good intentions and selective memory, and while I sat in silence, smiling through the grief, the betrayal, and the deafening silence that followed the will reading, something in me stopped trying to be understanding and started calculating. What no one expected, especially not Tina, was that I was paying attention while they assumed I was unraveling. They thought I was too fragile to act, too consumed with grief and disappointment to notice that the vultures had already begun circling, not just around the estate, but around the narrative itself. Tina, true to form, didn't waste a moment. She started posting online about honoring Mom's legacy and the journey of healing, which, as it turned out, included browsing interior designers for the house she was already calling hers and showing off a necklace in one of her Instagram stories that had belonged to our grandmother. The same necklace Mom once said was only for Lisa because she always asked before borrowing things. She was weaving her story, brick by brick, social post by social post, and the more she smiled in those curated little snapshots of grief, the more determined I became to flip the story she was trying to sell. I didn't want to make a scene. That was too easy to dismiss. Scenes are what unstable women create when they feel powerless. What I wanted was something colder, something meticulous, something that would grow slowly, like ivy on brick. Quiet, creeping, inevitable. I stopped answering phone calls, especially from relatives who just wanted to check in to make sure I wasn't going to do anything rash. I let them believe I was licking my wounds in some dimly lit apartment, too hurt to move forward, while in reality I was assembling the biggest act of controlled chaos I'd ever attempted. The first thing I did was make copies, not just of the house keys, which I still had, but of every document related to the estate I could get my hands on. Insurance forms, old receipts, medical bills, even old letters between Mom and her attorney. I found tucked inside a shoebox in her closet. I scanned them, backed them up, and put them on a password-protected flash drive I kept taped under my kitchen sink. It might sound paranoid, but I knew how Tina worked. She would smile to your face and erase you from the family scrapbook in the same breath. And if she ever caught wind of what I was doing, she would find a way to either undo it or make it look like I'd gone completely off the rails. Then I got to work on the house. Not in a dramatic, trash everything kind of way. No, I was strategic. I started in the basement, where the least sentimental but most useful items were stored. Extra bedding, old lamps, furniture we'd always meant to donate but never did. I rented a truck on weekends under a friend's name and drove load after load to women's shelters, thrift stores, community outreach centers. Any place that could make good use of what Tina would have sold on Craigslist for wine money. I didn't just dump it either. I asked for donation receipts, got signatures, took photos with staff, documented every single transfer, complete with timestamps and contact names, because I wasn't just giving things away. I was building a paper trail that would be impossible to ignore when the time came to present it. The upstairs took longer, the heirlooms required more finesse. I knew what Tina would want. The vintage china, the pearl earrings, the wedding quilt from our great-grandmother that had once been promised to me when I was 15 and responsible enough to help clean it after every Thanksgiving. I didn't give them away recklessly. I selected organizations carefully, historical preservation groups for antiques, scholarship auctions for jewelry, and in one particularly satisfying move, I donated our mother's piano, the same one Tina used to brag about playing for college recitals she never actually attended, to a community center that taught music to low-income kids. The director even sent me a video of a little girl playing Twinkle Twinkle Little Star on it 2 weeks later. I cried watching it, but not out of sadness. It was relief. It was purpose. I kept it all quiet, not because I was hiding, but because timing mattered more than noise. If I had said anything too soon, if I had posted online or confronted Tina directly, it would have become a drama, and drama only works when people still think you're emotional and irrational. I needed to be silent long enough that when I finally spoke, my words would land like a hammer. I knew Tina wasn't checking up on the house. She was too busy trying to integrate her version of events into polite society, telling anyone who would listen about the emotional weight of executing a will, how hard it had been to carry out Mom's wishes, knowing how difficult it must be for Lisa, and how she was just trying to bring everyone back together. Her performance was impeccable, I'll give her that. People love a graceful air, but what they love even more is a well-timed reckoning. By the time Tina finally decided to do a walkthrough of the house, probably to start planning where her custom bar cart would go, I had already emptied out 3 rooms, donated half the contents of the attic, transferred the title of one antique wardrobe to a preservation nonprofit, and moved all remaining valuable documents into safe storage. With a friend in another city, I wasn't worried about her calling the police or a lawyer because nothing I had touched had officially been processed through the estate transition yet. And technically, Mom had left no instructions on the household item division, only real estate and financials. And as far as the sentimental items went, well, it's hard to argue theft when you're trying to prove emotional attachment to things you never knew existed. When Tina texted me, finally noticing that the china cabinet was missing and the bedroom had been reorganized, she didn't accuse me. She played innocent as always. "Hey, just wondering if you moved some stuff? I think the movers might have gotten dates confused." I didn't reply, not that day, not the day after. I let her wonder, let her imagine whether I'd snapped or simply slipped away. It was only when she called me a week later, her voice laced with faux concern and thinly veiled suspicion, that I answered. And even then, all I said was, "Don't worry, everything's where it needs to be. You'll see soon enough." Because that was the moment I realized something even more powerful than revenge. When people expect you to be angry, silence becomes terrifying. And I was just getting started. There is a strange calm that settles in when you know exactly what you're going to do, not in the impulsive, rage-fueled way that people expect from someone who's been wronged, but in the cold, deliberate fashion of someone who has taken the time to imagine every detail, account for every variable, and ensure that when the moment comes, nothing will be left to chance. And by the time the invitations went out, each one handwritten on thick cardstock with elegant lettering that read more like a wedding announcement than a family dinner, I knew I had every piece on the board exactly where I wanted them, each player walking into a story they didn't know had already been written. It started with a phone call to Aunt Carrie, who, despite her stiff demeanor and compulsive tendency to retell stories you never asked to hear, had always loved the idea of a proper family gathering, especially after funerals or holidays. When emotions were still raw and people were just drunk enough to speak their minds. I told her I was planning a small dinner, something simple, in Mom's honor, just to bring everyone together and let go of the tension. And her voice brightened instantly, like someone had just offered her the final word in an argument she thought she'd lost. From there, the guest list filled itself. Cousins, in-laws, neighbors who had hovered during Mom's illness like well-meaning ghosts bringing casseroles and unsolicited prayers, and even a few of Tina's old college friends, the ones who believed every perfectly filtered sob story she posted online, and still commented things like, "You're so strong, babe," on her Instagram. I sent each of them the same invitation. No hint of drama, no indication that anything other than wine, food, and sentimental stories would be waiting for them. And Tina, of course, got hers hand-delivered. I knew she'd open it in her kitchen, probably while sipping something expensive, reading it out loud to no one in particular, smiling at the thought that I was finally coming to terms with everything, finally accepting her version of how things were meant to be. The dinner was scheduled for a Saturday. 2 weeks from the day she first texted me about the missing items in the house, and I chose the venue carefully, not a restaurant, not someone's backyard, but a private event space downtown. Just fancy enough to feel important, but small enough that every table felt like a spotlight. It had brick walls, dim lighting, and just enough vintage charm to make it seem like the kind of place our mother would have appreciated, though I doubt she'd have enjoyed the reason we were all gathering. I coordinated with a caterer, an old friend from high school, who owed me a favor and didn't ask too many questions. And together we crafted a menu that felt like nostalgia. Roast chicken with lemon and thyme, Mom's favorite green bean casserole recipe, mashed potatoes made with too much butter, and of course the signature cherry cobbler that she always insisted should be served with real whipped cream, not that canned nonsense. I made sure the place settings were identical. The flowers were white lilies and forget-me-nots, and the wine was the exact vintage Tina had brought to the will reading, because I wanted everything to feel eerily familiar, as if the ghost of that night was watching. The day arrived clear and quiet, with the kind of calm that makes you nervous, and I got there early, walked the room, checked the chairs, adjusted the candles, and reminded myself that I wasn't doing this for closure. I was doing this for clarity. I wasn't interested in screaming matches or dramatic outbursts. I wanted stillness, silence, and that moment of heavy realization when everyone at that table would understand exactly what had happened, not in fragments or accusations, but in full, brutal truth, delivered at the exact moment they were least prepared for it. The guests began to arrive around 6, filtering in with cautious smiles and polite hugs, most of them unsure whether they were stepping into a memorial or a mediation, but too curious or too guilty not to show up. I greeted each one personally, thanked them for coming, led them to their seats, and resisted the urge to analyze their expressions too deeply. I wasn't looking for allies. I wasn't trying to win anyone over. I was just setting the stage. Tina arrived last, of course. Fashionably late, predictably radiant, dressed in something cream-colored and understated, the way people dress when they want to appear humble while knowing they're the center of attention. She kissed cheeks, offered her signature laugh, and made a point to compliment the venue, saying it had a really nice energy, as if she had anything to do with the planning. She took her seat across from me, and for the first time since the will reading, we locked eyes. She smiled. I didn't. Dinner was served. Conversation flowed easily at first. Safe topics, weather, vacations, who brought what to the last family potluck, and I played along, laughed when I needed to, nodded in the right places, poured wine with a steady hand. No one asked why I'd suddenly gone quiet for 2 months. No one mentioned the will. That was Tina's brilliance. She kept things so sanitized that even grief started to feel like a brand she managed. But I knew that was about to end. When dessert came out, the cherry cobbler, warm and slightly imperfect, just the way Mom made it, I waited until the plates were on the table, until forks were in hand, until that first sip of wine had been taken, and the lull between stories had dropped into that rare kind of silence where people actually listen. And that's when I stood. No glass clink, no announcement, just me, clearing my throat and beginning to speak. I just want to say how grateful I am that you all came, I said, keeping my voice steady, calm, and almost too gentle. Mom would have loved this. She always wanted us to be together, even if it took a little drama to get there. Some people chuckled. Tina smiled, eyes narrowed, waiting for the twist. She knew me too well not to sense the shift. That's why I think now is the perfect time to share something I've been working on, I continued. See, over the past couple months, I've been spending a lot of time going through the house, the one Mom and I lived in together for the last 3 years of her life, the one where I held her hair back while she threw up from chemo, the one where I sat by her bedside while she forgot where she was and who I was and whether she'd ever see another spring. Now the room was still. Tina had stopped smiling. Her wine glass was half raised, frozen. I wanted to honor her, Aikahan, I said, not with a plaque or a speech, but with something lasting. So I've donated everything, every heirloom, every piece of jewelry, every piece of furniture with a story behind it, to charities, shelters, and community programs, all in her name. There was a beat, a pause, a collective inhaling of breath. I looked directly at Tina. So thank you for leaving me nothing, I said, because it made giving everything away that much sweeter. And that's when Tina, in her carefully curated silence, took a sip of wine, gagged, and started to choke. For a moment, that felt like it stretched far beyond the walls of that modest event space, beyond the carefully arranged tables and the candlelight that flickered like nervous anticipation, and even beyond the steady breathing of those seated around us who had suddenly gone silent. The only sound in the room was the metallic clatter of a dessert fork hitting porcelain, the unmistakable sound of something small but deeply significant slipping from someone's hand. When they realize, too late, that they no longer have control of the situation. Tina's eyes, wide and unblinking, locked on mine as she coughed violently, her hand grasping at her throat with a panic she couldn't disguise with charm or manipulation. The kind of panic that strips a person down to their most human core. And yet, as a distant cousin instinctively rose from his seat and Aunt Carrie reached across the table for a glass of water that wouldn't help, I stood perfectly still, watching, not with malice, but with the kind of clear-eyed presence one reserves for witnessing something inevitable unfold. Eventually, Tina caught her breath, not without effort, and the silence that had overtaken the room began to crack just slightly, like the first splinters in glass before a full shatter. Her coughing turned into small gasps, followed by that high-pitched, breathy sound people make when they're too embarrassed to cry, but too shaken to speak, and I could tell by the way she dabbed her mouth with the edge of her napkin, more to recover composure than to clean anything off, that she was scrambling to recalibrate, to find the version of herself that could spin this moment into something survivable. But it was too late. The spell had broken. The illusion she'd so carefully cultivated over the past year, that of the loyal daughter, the grieving executor, the reluctant but noble inheritor of our mother's legacy, had cracked wide open under the weight of one undeniable truth. The story she thought she had complete authorship over no longer belonged to her, and everyone in that room now knew it. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, didn't raise my glass in some theatrical gesture of triumph. I simply sat back down and unfolded my napkin, placing it in my lap with slow, measured grace, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if we hadn't just rewritten family history in the span of a single sentence. I knew better than to speak again. The silence was doing all the work for me. Eyes darted. People whispered in tones just low enough not to carry. And across the table, Tina's posture sank inch by inch, her shoulders folding in on themselves like a house caving under pressure. The cherry cobbler in front of her remained untouched, the whipped cream starting to melt into a sad, collapsing puddle that mirrored her own slow unraveling. No one asked me to elaborate. They didn't need to. The details didn't matter, not yet anyway. The revelation had landed with enough weight that everything else, every receipt, every signed letter from the charities, every photograph of children playing with the toys she thought she'd sell, every antique chair now sitting in the waiting room of a domestic violence shelter. All of it could come later. Tonight wasn't about evidence. Tonight was about truth, delivered with surgical precision at a moment when no one could look away. After a few strained attempts at restarting conversation, some awkward laughter, a few murmured questions about dessert recipes, the dinner began to dissolve, not in any official way, but in that organic fashion where people start collecting their coats and pretending they have somewhere to be, anywhere to be, because the room has become too charged, too heavy with the weight of unspoken questions. No one wanted to ask Tina what she meant to do next, and no one wanted to ask me how I'd managed to do what I did without anyone knowing. And so they left, 2 by 2, whispering apologies, hugging too tightly, making promises to call that we all knew they wouldn't keep. Tina was among the last to leave, hovering near the coat rack like someone waiting for a bus that might not come. She didn't approach me, didn't try to argue or defend or demand. She just stood there, small and pale, in her cream-colored dress that suddenly seemed far too bright for such a dark moment. Her hands trembling slightly as she fumbled with her scarf. For a brief second, I thought she might say something, might try to claw back even a fraction of her narrative, but instead she turned and walked out. The click of her heels on the hardwood floor, the final punctuation mark on a chapter I never agreed to be part of. Once the last guest had gone, I lingered in the room, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. I walked slowly between the empty chairs, touching the backs lightly as I passed, remembering who sat where, who looked at me with confusion, with pity, with dawning respect. I picked up the wine glass Tina had left behind, still half full, with a faint lipstick mark on the rim, and poured it into a nearby planter, watching the red swirl briefly before disappearing into the soil. I had no use for symbols, but something about that small gesture felt complete. I gathered the leftover donation brochures I had placed subtly among the centerpieces, each one detailing the organizations that now housed the things my mother once loved, and tucked them into my bag. No one had asked for them, but I knew a few people had glanced at them during dinner, and eventually someone would reach out, curious, unsure of what they were supposed to believe anymore. Before I left, I took one final look at the space, now dim and quiet, as if it too had exhaled after holding its breath all evening. I raised my glass, not in a toast to the room or the people or even myself, but to the absence, the clean, clear absence of anything left unsaid. To my mother, wherever she was, I whispered, I didn't need your things. I just needed my name back. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, leaving behind the empty room, the finished cobblers, the stunned silence, and the woman who thought she had won, I knew, without a doubt, that the final word had been mine.